A 19-year-old with no lawyer is charged with car theft. But when he enters the courtroom, everyone underestimates him, until a twist of fate changes everything. Can a teenager outsmart the system? It is in his fight for his freedom that he exposes flaws in the justice system, leaving the public stunned. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the small courtroom. Peter Olson sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. At just 19, he looked out of place among the polished wood and solemn faces surrounding him. His short brown hair was slightly disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights he'd spent worrying about what came next. Across the room, Judge Philip Cornwall adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable but undeniably stern. To Peter, the judge seemed more like a statue than a man, cold, unyielding, and impossible to sway. The prosecutor, Mr. White, rose from his seat with an air of practiced confidence. He was middle-aged, with slicked-back gray hair and a sharp suit that screamed authority. As he began laying out the case against Peter, his voice carried the weight of certainty. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "the evidence is clear. On the night of October 12th, this young man, Peter Olson, was found in possession of a stolen luxury vehicle belonging to Mr. Richard Hayes. Fingerprints matching Mr. Olson's were discovered on the driver's side door, leaving no doubt as to his involvement." Peter's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his blue eyes fixed on the prosecutor. He knew the fingerprints weren't enough to prove theft. They could have been left there days earlier when he had worked on the car at the garage where he was employed part-time. But explaining that would require someone to listen, and so far no one seemed interested in hearing his side of the story. Mr. White continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "At just 19 years old, Mr. Olson has already demonstrated a reckless disregard for the law. This isn't merely a case of youthful indiscretion. It's a blatant act of criminal behavior." The prosecutor paused for effect, letting his words hang in the air before turning to face Peter directly. "Theft is theft, Your Honor, regardless of age." Judge Cornwall leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Olson," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension, "do you have legal representation?" Peter hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He had hoped his mother might be able to scrape together enough money for a lawyer, but their modest income left little room for luxuries or emergencies. Swallowing hard, he stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. For a moment, all eyes were on him, and he felt the full weight of their scrutiny. "No, Your Honor," Peter replied, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves raging inside him. "I don't have a lawyer." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and even Judge Cornwall raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Very well," the judge said after a pause. "We'll proceed as scheduled unless you intend to request a continuance to secure counsel." Peter shook his head firmly. "I won't need one, Your Honor. I'll represent myself." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes when everyone is collectively holding their breath. Mr. White exchanged a glance with the judge, both men wearing expressions of disbelief mixed with thinly veiled amusement. Even the jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to take Peter seriously or dismiss him outright. Judge Cornwall leaned back in his chair, studying Peter with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "You understand the gravity of this decision, Mr. Olson? Representing oneself in a court of law is no small undertaking." "I understand, Your Honor," Peter said, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. "And I'm prepared." For a brief moment, something flickered in Judge Cornwall's eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps respect, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. With a curt nod, he addressed the court. "Proceed, then, Mr. White." As the prosecutor resumed his opening statement, Peter returned to his seat, his mind racing. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew one thing for certain. He hadn't stolen that car, and if no one else was going to fight for the truth, he would have to do it himself. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly as Peter sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of legal textbooks and case files. The dim light from an overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room, illuminating his tired but determined face. It was nearly midnight, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator. His mother, Caitlin, had gone to bed hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the daunting task ahead. Peter flipped through a dog-eared copy of Criminal Law, Principles and Cases, his finger tracing lines of text as he read. Notes scribbled in the margins, his mother's handwriting from her days as a paralegal, offered insights that felt like lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. He paused on a section about cross-examination techniques, underlining key phrases and jotting down ideas in a worn notebook. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency could be the thread that unraveled the prosecution's case. He spread out the police report in front of him, studying it intently. The fingerprints were the cornerstone of their argument, but something didn't add up. Why were they only found on the driver's side door? If he had driven the car, there should have been prints on the steering wheel, the gear shift, the rearview mirror, any number of places. Yet the report mentioned nothing beyond the single fingerprint match on the exterior handle. Peter circled the discrepancy, his lips curling into a faint smile. This was his first crack in the prosecution's armor. Next, he turned his attention to Mr. Hayes' statement. The car owner had claimed Peter was the only person who could have accessed the vehicle, but Peter knew that wasn't true. Just weeks earlier, Hayes had brought the car into the garage where Peter worked, complaining about a faulty brake light. Peter remembered clearly. It was the same day Hayes mentioned lending the car to friends for a weekend getaway. That detail hadn't made it into the official record, and Peter suspected Hayes had conveniently omitted it to strengthen the case against him. As the hours slipped by, Peter's notes grew more detailed. He outlined potential questions for the arresting officer, drafted arguments to challenge the fingerprint evidence, and even sketched a timeline of events leading up to his arrest. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, he had transformed the kitchen table into a makeshift war room, complete with highlighted documents, sticky notes, and diagrams connecting pieces of evidence. When morning arrived, Peter showered quickly and dressed in his best outfit, a neatly pressed button-down shirt and slacks borrowed from his uncle. Standing in front of the mirror, he practiced his opening statement, rehearsing each word until it sounded confident and measured. He knew appearances mattered almost as much as substance. If he wanted the jury to take him seriously, he couldn't afford to look or act like a scared teenager. At the courthouse, Peter arrived early, carrying a stack of papers and his trusty notebook. The bailiff eyed him curiously as he took his seat at the defendant's table, but Peter ignored the stares, focusing instead on organizing his materials. When Judge Cornwall entered the room, followed by Mr. White, Peter stood respectfully, his posture straight and his expression calm. "Mr. Olson," Judge Cornwall began, his tone laced with skepticism, "are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor," Peter replied firmly. "I'm ready." Mr. White smirked, exchanging a glance with the judge that didn't go unnoticed by Peter. The prosecutor clearly thought this would be an easy win, a kid playing lawyer out of his depth and destined to fail. But Peter refused to let their dismissive attitudes shake him. He reminded himself why he was here, to prove that justice wasn't reserved for those who could afford it. When it was his turn to speak, Peter rose from his seat, his voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're about to hear is not a story of guilt, but of assumptions gone wrong. The prosecution has presented a narrative based on incomplete evidence and selective facts. Today, I will show you the truth, not through conjecture, but through logic, reason, and the law." The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that comes when expectations are shattered. Peter's eloquence caught everyone off guard, including Judge Cornwall, who leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in surprise. Even Mr. White shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence wavering. Peter continued, laying out his strategy with precision. He explained the inconsistencies in the fingerprint evidence, questioned the reliability of Mr. Hayes' testimony, and emphasized the lack of direct proof tying him to the alleged theft. By the time he finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully, while others scribbled notes. Peter hadn't achieved anything yet, but he realized that people were starting to see him in a different light, in a way he hadn't seen before. As the proceedings moved forward, Peter returned to his seat, his heart racing but his resolve unshaken. He knew the hardest battles were still ahead, but for now, he had accomplished something crucial. He had forced the court to see him not as a reckless teenager, but as a formidable opponent. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Peter stood to cross-examine Officer Daniels, the arresting officer. The officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted his belt and squared his shoulders before taking the stand. He exuded confidence, clearly expecting this to be a routine affair. But Peter's sharp eyes betrayed none of his nerves. Instead, they gleamed with focus. "Officer Daniels," Peter began, his tone polite but firm, "you stated in your report that my fingerprints were found on the driver's side door of Mr. Hayes' vehicle. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Officer Daniels replied, nodding. Peter paused for effect, letting the jury absorb the statement. Then he leaned slightly forward, his voice steady. "And where else were my fingerprints located? On the steering wheel, the gearshift, the dashboard?" The officer hesitated, glancing at Mr. White, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No," Daniels admitted after a moment. "They were only found on the exterior handle." Peter nodded slowly, as if processing the information. "So, to clarify, the only evidence linking me to the car is a single fingerprint on the outside of the vehicle." "Correct." "That's correct," the officer confirmed, though his earlier confidence seemed to waver. Peter turned toward the jury, gesturing subtly. "If I had driven the car, wouldn't it make sense for my fingerprints to also appear inside the vehicle, on surfaces like the steering wheel or gearshift? Doesn't the absence of such evidence suggest that I never actually operated the car?" A murmur rippled through the gallery, and several jurors exchanged thoughtful looks. Judge Cornwall raised a hand to silence the room, his expression unreadable but attentive. Officer Daniels cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "It's possible you wore gloves while driving," he offered lamely. Peter arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Gloves? In the middle of October, when temperatures were mild enough for short sleeves. And yet, somehow, I left a fingerprint on the outside of the car but not inside." He shook his head slightly, letting the absurdity of the suggestion sink in. "Isn't it more likely, officer, that my fingerprints were already on the door from when I worked on the car at the garage weeks earlier?" The officer didn't respond immediately, caught off guard by Peter's pointed question. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its previous authority. "I can't speculate about that." "No further questions," Peter said smoothly, returning to his seat. As he passed the prosecutor's table, he caught a glimpse of Mr. White scribbling furiously on a notepad, his face flushed with frustration. Next, Peter called Mr. Richard Hayes, the car owner, to the stand. Hayes, a well-dressed man in his late 40s, looked uneasy as he took the oath. His discomfort grew when Peter approached the podium, his calm demeanor masking the intensity behind his piercing gaze. "Mr. Hayes," Peter began, his tone conversational, "you testified earlier that I was the only person who could have accessed your car on the night in question. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Hayes replied, though his voice carried a hint of hesitation. Peter tilted his head slightly, studying the witness. "Yet, according to your own statement during the initial investigation, you lent the car to friends just days before the alleged theft. Isn't that true?" Hayes shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "Well, yes, I did lend it out briefly, but they returned it before the incident." "And how many people had access to the car during that time?" Peter pressed. "I'm not sure exactly," Hayes admitted reluctantly. "Maybe 3 or 4. Peter allowed a beat of silence to pass, letting the implication settle over the courtroom. "So, to summarize, multiple individuals, including your friends, had access to the car prior to its disappearance. Yet you're certain that I, specifically, am the one responsible for stealing it." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly flustered. "I believe so, yes. Peter turned to face the jury, his expression earnest. Ladies and gentlemen, does this sound like conclusive evidence to you? Or does it seem more like speculation based on incomplete facts? He let the question hang in the air, his gaze sweeping across the jurors' faces. As Hayes stepped down from the stand, Peter noticed subtle shifts in the jury's body language. Some members frowned thoughtfully, while others whispered quietly to one another. Even Judge Cornwall appeared more engaged now, leaning forward slightly as he observed the proceedings. Later, during a recess, Peter reviewed his notes, mentally preparing for the next phase of his defense. He knew he had planted seeds of doubt, but the prosecution still held the advantage of presumption. To truly dismantle their case, he needed something undeniable, a piece of evidence that would leave no room for interpretation. When the trial resumed, Peter requested permission to introduce new testimony. Judge Cornwall granted it cautiously, his curiosity piqued. Moments later, a middle-aged man with grease-stained hands entered the courtroom and took the stand. It was Mr. Thompson, the mechanic who had serviced Mr. Hayes' car shortly before the alleged theft. "Mr. Thompson," Peter began, addressing the witness warmly, "can you tell the court what you were doing on October 11th, the day before the car went missing?" Thompson nodded confidently. "Yes, sir. I was working on the brake light system for Mr. Hayes' vehicle. It had been acting up, so I replaced a faulty wire and tested the lights to ensure everything was functioning properly." Peter smiled faintly, sensing victory within reach. "And do you recall seeing anyone else around the car that day?" "Nope," Thompson replied without hesitation. "Just me and Pete here." He gestured toward Peter, who stood poised at the podium. "Pete was helping me move another car into the bay while I finished up. He didn't touch Mr. Hayes' vehicle once I started working on it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as the implications sank in. Peter turned to the jury, his voice steady and impassioned. "This testimony confirms two critical points. First, that I was occupied with other work at the exact time the car was supposedly being tampered with. Second, that the last known person to interact with the vehicle was not me, but Mr. Thompson, a professional mechanic with no motive to steal it." Mr. White jumped to his feet, objecting vehemently, but even he seemed rattled. Judge Cornwall silenced him with a wave of his hand, his eyes narrowing as he considered the new development. By the time Peter concluded his questioning, the tide had begun to turn. Doubt crept into the expressions of the jurors, their earlier certainty crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence. There was an optimistic feeling that the truth might prevail in the end. The courtroom was charged with tension as Peter prepared to deliver his closing argument. The air felt heavier, the murmurs from the gallery quieter, as if everyone collectively understood that the trial had reached its pivotal moment. Peter stood slowly, adjusting his tie, a gesture meant to convey composure rather than nervousness. He took a deep breath, letting his gaze sweep over the jury before he began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Peter said, his voice steady and clear, "this case is not about me, it's about fairness. It's about whether we allow assumptions to take the place of evidence, or whether we demand proof before assigning blame." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. The jurors leaned forward slightly, their expressions attentive. Even Judge Cornwall, who had maintained an air of detached impartiality throughout the trial, seemed more engaged now, his pen resting motionless in his hand. Peter gestured toward the prosecution's table. "The state has accused me of stealing Mr. Hayes' car based on two pieces of evidence: a single fingerprint on the exterior door handle and the word of the car's owner. But let's examine those claims carefully. My fingerprints were found on the outside of the vehicle, something easily explained by my legitimate work on the car at the garage days earlier. Yet there are no prints inside the car, none on the steering wheel, none on the gearshift, none anywhere else you'd expect them to be if I had driven it. Does that sound like the behavior of a thief?" He turned to face the jury directly, his tone earnest but unwavering. "And what about Mr. Hayes? He told you I was the only person who could have stolen his car. But under cross-examination, he admitted lending it to friends shortly before the alleged theft. Multiple people had access to that vehicle. How can we possibly conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that I'm responsible? Peter moved closer to the jury box, lowering his voice slightly to create intimacy. Then there's the testimony of Mr. Thompson, the mechanic. He confirmed that I was working alongside him when the car was last serviced. Not only did I not touch the vehicle after that point, but Mr. Thompson himself was the last person known to interact with it. If anyone should be questioned further, shouldn't it be him, or perhaps Mr. Hayes' friends who borrowed the car? He stepped back, spreading his arms slightly as if to encompass the entire courtroom. This isn't just about me proving my innocence. It's about holding the system accountable. Justice requires more than circumstantial evidence and selective facts. It demands truth. And the truth here is simple. There is no credible evidence linking me to this crime. Peter's voice grew firmer, carrying a quiet intensity that commanded attention. If we rush to judgment without demanding real proof, we risk punishing the innocent while letting the guilty walk free. That's not justice, that's failure. And I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that doesn't happen today. As Peter returned to his seat, the room remained silent for several seconds, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Mr. White rose to deliver his rebuttal, but his usual confidence was noticeably shaken. His attempts to discredit Peter's arguments lacked conviction, his voice rising defensively as he tried to reassert the prosecution's narrative. Yet even he seemed aware that the jury's skepticism had grown too large to ignore. When both sides concluded their remarks, Judge Cornwall addressed the jury. Members of the jury, you have heard all the evidence presented in this case. It is now your duty to deliberate and determine whether the prosecution has proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Please retire to the deliberation room. The jury filed out silently, their faces unreadable masks. Peter sat down, exhaling deeply. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, the adrenaline of the past few minutes beginning to ebb. Around him, the gallery buzzed softly with speculation, but Peter tuned it out, focusing instead on the rhythmic ticking of the courtroom clock. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Peter replayed every moment of the trial in his mind, the cross-examinations, the testimonies, the subtle reactions of the jurors. He had done everything he could. Now all that remained was to wait. Finally, the bailiff entered the room and announced that the jury had reached a verdict. As the foreperson stood to read the decision, Peter braced himself, his heart pounding in his chest. The courtroom fell silent once again, every eye fixed on the jury. We, the jury, find the defendant, Peter Olson, not guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Peter sat frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. Then, slowly, he exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. He allowed himself to believe that he might truly be free. Judge Cornwall banged his gavel to restore order, though his expression betrayed a flicker of admiration for the young man who had defied expectations. Case dismissed, he declared, his voice firm but tinged with something resembling respect. As Peter gathered his notes and stood to leave the courtroom, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. He glanced briefly at Mr. White, whose face was pale with frustration, then at Judge Cornwall, who gave him a curt nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, but Peter ignored them, his focus inward. He thought about the long nights spent studying, the moments of doubt that had nearly overwhelmed him, and the resilience that had carried him through. This victory wasn't just personal. It was proof that determination and knowledge could overcome even the greatest odds. Years later, when Peter returned to the same courtroom as a defense attorney, he would remember this day vividly. It had been the turning point in his life. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the jury's verdict echoed through the room. Peter Olson stood still, his face a mixture of disbelief and relief. The weight of weeks of uncertainty lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet pride that he had fought for and won: his freedom. As Judge Cornwall banged his gavel to restore order, Peter glanced around the room. Reporters jotted notes furiously, while spectators whispered among themselves, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Judge Cornwall addressed the court one final time. "Mr. Olson," he said, his tone more measured than before, "you are free to go. This court acknowledges your diligence and determination in presenting your case." It was a rare acknowledgement from the stern judge, and Peter nodded respectfully, meeting his gaze without hesitation. As Peter exited the courthouse, the bright sunlight felt almost surreal after the dim confines of the courtroom. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but Peter moved past them with purpose, his focus inward. He thought about the long nights spent poring over legal texts, the moments when doubt had threatened to overwhelm him, and the unwavering support of his mother, who waited for him outside. She embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you could do it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. In the weeks that followed, Peter returned to his job at the garage, but something had shifted inside him. The trial had ignited a passion he hadn't known existed, a desire to fight for justice, for himself and for others who might find themselves trapped in a system that seemed stacked against them. He enrolled in night classes at a local community college, studying law with a fervor that surprised even his professors. His grades were exceptional, and within a few years, he transferred to a prestigious university to complete his degree. Years passed, and Peter Olson became a name people recognized, not as the teenager who defended himself in court, but as a skilled defense attorney known for his sharp mind and unyielding dedication to his clients. He specialized in cases involving wrongful accusations, often taking on clients who couldn't afford representation. His pursuit of truth and justice has brought him great reputation in his career. One crisp autumn morning, Peter found himself standing in the same courtroom where his journey had begun. This time, however, he wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase filled with meticulously organized files. The case before him involved a young man accused of vandalism, a charge Peter suspected was based on circumstantial evidence and societal bias. As he approached the defendant's table, he noticed Judge Cornwall seated above, now older and grayer, his once stern expression softened by time. When Judge Cornwall recognized Peter, he paused briefly, his eyes widening in surprise. Then, with a subtle nod, he greeted him. "Mr. Olson," he said, his voice carrying a hint of respect. "It's been some time." Peter smiled faintly, inclining his head. "Your Honor," he replied. "Thank you for acknowledging me." Before the proceedings began, Judge Cornwall leaned forward slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Mr. Olson," he said, his voice quieter but clear enough for those nearby to hear, "your case taught me something important. Justice isn't just about following the letter of the law, it's about ensuring the truth prevails, even when it's inconvenient. I've tried to carry that lesson with me in every case since." Peter met the judge's eyes, genuinely surprised by the admission. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said sincerely. "That means more than I can express." The trial proceeded, and Peter's performance was nothing short of masterful. He dismantled the prosecution's case with the same precision and logic that had earned him an acquittal years earlier. By the end, the jury deliberated only briefly before returning a verdict of not guilty. As Peter shook hands with his client, a young man whose future had just been salvaged, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. Later that evening, Peter sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling beyond the window. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook, the same one he had used during his own trial. Its pages were worn and faded, filled with hastily scribbled notes and underlined passages. Flipping through it brought back memories of sleepless nights and moments of doubt, but also of triumph and resilience. Peter closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, locking it gently. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as thoughts swirled in his mind. That day in court had changed everything, not just for him, but for the countless lives he had touched since. He realized now that justice wasn't just about winning cases. It was about giving people a voice, a chance to be heard, and a fair shot at redemption. As he turned off the desk lamp and prepared to leave, Peter allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but he was ready. After all, he had already proven that knowledge, determination, and a steadfast belief in fairness could overcome even the toughest odds. And as long as there were injustices to fight, Peter Olson would be there, standing firm in the pursuit of truth. Peter Olson proved that knowledge and determination can overcome even the toughest odds. Has anyone ever underestimated you, only to be proven wrong later? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey. See you in the next video.